Hi, my name's Michelle Marshall, and I'm here today to present a database that I've started for diabetes patients and their doctors to help look at their information, how they're doing, and address any issues that might need to be looked at as far as the patient's um, weight, the patient's glucose values, their A1C, whether or not they're exercising enough, and also to evaluate any complications that the patient may be experiencing already as a result of their diabetes. So the first step that I did in this whole process is to create the actual database itself. I did not have a database yet for diabetes, and so that was my first step, as you can see here, which was to create the database. Then I started creating the tables that are going to house my information for my diabetic patients. The first table is a demographics table. We're going to have a patient ID that is actually going to automatically generate each time we add a patient. They'll get an automatic new ID. That ID is going to be unique, and that ID is also going to be our primary key. I have multiple tables that are part of my diabetes database, and all of the tables are interrelated with that patient ID number as the primary thing that ties them all together. So my demographics table has patient's last name, first name, date of birth. I included their race, sex, height and weight, and physician so that if we wanted to look at the information as a whole and see, are we having certain problems with our diabetes care that is of a particular race or of a particular sex? That information we could look at here. We could also look and see if a particular physician has patients who are struggling more than other physicians. Perhaps there's something in their plan that they're not doing as well as they could be. So you can see that I set up each field for my demographics table. Most of the fields are going to take, the ID is going to take a number, the names, and race, sex, and physician, those all just take a variety of characters. We've got the height and weight in decimals. And I actually found as I started populating my table that having the height with a decimal 2 comma 1, it actually did not want to accept a height of, say, 72.5. I'm not exactly sure that I understand the reason behind that, but you can see that I did have to alter my demographics table so that my height accepted a decimal that was 4 comma 1. Most of my fields in my demographics table, I do not want them to be able to skip a result or not enter a result. So everything's set as not accepting a null value. The next thing that I did was create a database of patient addresses. I initially decided to separate this out of the demographics just to keep the tables a little bit more manageable. So as I mentioned before, the patient ID is what's going to tie everything together here. This is a foreign key going back to that demographics table. And so this is just going to simply be the patient's address. Again, we could look at some of this information to see, if we have patients who are struggling with their diabetes control, are they in a more rural area or in a more city area, that type of thing. That can just give us some good information to look at as a whole. The next table that I created was a table for diet and exercise. I wanted the patients to be able to log in exercise that they did, what type of exercise they did, how long they exercised. And then we're also including some meal information in how much grams of carbohydrates they ate at each meal. I decided to go with the date and time for logging the exercise and the meal values. Kind of after I thought about this later, I thought I could have possibly done the meal as just a meal type, meaning breakfast, lunch, dinner, or a snack, and the number of grams of carbohydrates. So that might be something that would be perhaps easier to populate down the road, but for now, this is what I have. And then the next table is glucose and hemoglobin A1C values. And again, we're tying everything together. All of my tables are interconnected with this patient ID, which references back to the original demographics table. My glucose and hemoglobin A1C is able to be entered with a date and time. I did allow that some fields here, as well as in the previous diet and exercise table, are allowed to be null values because a patient might be entering in, say, a glucose value and they don't have a hemoglobin A1C at that time, or they might be entering in a meal where they didn't actually exercise as well. So just to point out that there are some null values allowed with those. And then my last table that I created was complications. And so what I wanted to be able to look at here is, if we have a patient where their glucose or their hemoglobin A1C indicates that they're struggling, do they have any diabetic complications that have already started? I chose to just go with kind of a self-reported diabetic complications rather than looking at a bunch of different symptoms and deciding on complications that way. So this is the point where I started to enter my data into my tables. And you can see I started off with my demographics and I entered all of my patient information here. I did not actually need to enter a patient ID because, as I said, that was going to auto increment and automatically assign a unique patient ID as I entered each patient's values. So when I get to the bottom of this entry field here, you can see I just have a select statement here to select everything from demographics, and I'm going to just run that so that I can show my table here that I generated with my data. And so you can see everything's filled in nicely. Each patient has a unique patient ID. If you go over, you can see that the physician is in here as well. So that is all of my patient ID, and I did enter in 20 patient values. The next thing that I did was add some addresses for my patient. So for each patient, I put in an address for the patient and their phone number. And so again, I did a select statement here just so that we could see the table of addresses, and that's populated here. And you can see my patient IDs are here that ties back to the patient IDs in my first demographics table. And each patient does have an address and a phone number recorded. We did not allow null values for any of the patient demographics or patient addresses. So the next bit of data entry that I did was entering in some diet and exercise information. And so I actually split this into two groups because in my first group, I entered in some dates and times where there was some exercise that was done and a length of time for that exercise. Oh, and I just see that I have a little spelling in hiking here, spelling error, sorry about that. So I entered in first some exercise values, and then I entered in some meal values. Again, this table, the diet and exercise table, I did allow some null values because a certain patient might have exercised but not entered in any meal information and vice versa. I actually have these tables to look at the very end. So the next thing that I did was I inserted some glucose values and some hemoglobin A1C values into that table. Each patient has sometimes multiple values. Again, this could be useful because we could look at an average glucose for a patient over a certain date range, or we could choose to just look at their hemoglobin A1C value and see what that is. And so I entered quite a bit of data here for this table, as you can see. I did allow null values because, again, there might be a time when a patient was having a hemoglobin A1C done that they did not have a glucose value done, and vice versa. Actually, most diabetic patients would have a lot of glucose values that they might have taken, and their hemoglobin A1C is only done every 3 months, typically. The last table that I populated was my complication table. I did allow null values here for diabetic patients that don't have any complications to report. They may have not had any complications that they know of so far. And so here are the values that I populated into my table. And then at the very end here, I've got my 3 select statements to generate the actual table. So first is my diet and exercise table, and there that is. So you can just see certain patients had some exercise values, but not necessarily meal values at the same time, and then the same thing for the meals. There's not necessarily exercise values. My glucose and hemoglobin A1C table, I'll generate that. And you can see, I have multiple entries for patients. Sometimes there's hemoglobin A1C values. Sometimes there's just glucose values. Sometimes there's both. So here's a patient that on October 5th had an A1C done and also had their glucose done at the same time. So there's quite a bit of data in this table, as you can see. And then my last table, just to view that, is my complications table. And so here you can see I basically entered each patient and entered any diabetic complications that they had reported. If there's nothing, that's because they either didn't know of any diabetic complications or didn't report any. So that is how the beginning of my diabetes database is looking. And I'm looking forward to working on the next phase of this database to show some further information. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good night.